An Iranian man who beheaded his 17-year-old wife in February 2022 was sentenced to just 8 years and 2 months in prison, sparking criticism over the leniency of the prison term. Following the murder of the teenager, a video began circulating online of her husband, Sajjad Heydari, walking in the provincial capital of Ahwaz, while smiling and carrying her severed head, Heydari holding a knife in one hand and the girl's head in another. Mom of one Mona Heydari was just 17 when she was dragged from a car outside the family home. A judiciary spokesman said the leniency of the sentence was due to Mona's parents having pardoned him for the murder rather than seeking retribution. Her father previously said that he had not given his consent for the killing. Mona had been married to her husband since the age of 12 and had given birth to their son when she was only 14. She had fled her violent husband with another man to Turkey. She fled her husband, who had refused her requests for a divorce. He allegedly used Interpol to trace his daughter and returned her to Iran. She had returned to Iran a few days before her murder last February because she had reportedly received assurances from her family that she would be safe. When they returned to Iran, her husband, who was also her cousin, slaughtered her, claiming she had shamed him. Shocking video evidence emerged of the killer husband carrying his wife's head in one hand and a huge knife in the other after murdering her. Heydari's brother, who had dumped Mona's headless corpse, was sentenced to 45 months in prison for complicity in intentional homicide. The court heard that the victim's father defended marrying her off at the age of 12 to a relative and added that violence in a relationship that she had fled from was normal. The dad described the husband that they chose for her as a good husband, saying that he worked hard and provided her with the best life. After the verdict, it was revealed that Mona's father had not insisted on Iran's Islamic law of retribution. He said, she was not forced to marry, and in fact the husband provided her with the very best of lives. It's true, there was fighting between them. And sometimes there was violence. And she would return home, but she only stayed for 2 or 3 days. And then he would pick her up and life would return to normal. These fights between husband and wife are completely normal, and I don't think there was a problem as she did not ask for a divorce. He admitted in hindsight that she was probably too young to marry, but added, "We got a certificate of confirmation that she was physically old enough to marry, and there was not any physical problem in the relationship." The family claimed that the husband was mocked and insulted by the fact that his wife had fled to Turkey with another man. The Women's Committee of the National Council of Resistance of Iran said the victim was forced to marry her cousin Sajjad Heydari when she was just 12 years old. They also said the young girl allegedly suffered domestic violence, and every time she expressed a desire to divorce him, her family pressured her to return home for the sake of their child. Local media said the brother of her husband wrapped the girl's body in a blanket and dumped it while the husband showed off his wife's head. In the video, the suspect is seen grinning from ear to ear as he holds the teenager's head, passing by local residents. The gruesome killing prompted fresh demands in Iran for a law aimed at preventing domestic violence and protecting victims. There were also calls for the minimum age of marriage for children to be raised. It is currently set at 13 for girls, although girls even younger than that can legally marry with judicial and parental consent. A predatory garage worker who beat primary school teacher Sabina Nessa to death in a sadistic and sexually motivated attack faces the prospect of life behind bars after admitting to her murder. Albanian national Koçi Selamaj, 36, used extreme violence to kill Mrs. Nessa, 28, whose body was uncovered underneath a pile of leaves in Cater Park, southeast London. The Mary Domino's delivery driver traveled to London and lurked around the Kidbrooke area, before grabbing the schoolteacher as she passed through on her way to meet a friend in the Depot bar. On September 17, 2021, CCTV footage captured the moment Selimaj chased and swiftly overwhelmed Mrs. Nessa by raining down more than 30 blows on her with a metal traffic triangle before carrying her away unconscious. Selimaj then strangled her in undergrowth and removed her tights and underwear in what was suspected to be a sexually motivated attack, prosecutors said. The body of Mrs. Nessa, who taught a Year 1 class at Rushy Green Primary School in Catford, was found nearly 24 hours later, covered with grass near a community center in the park. Prosecutors made clear that Nessa was not known to the murderer beforehand, and he was targeting any vulnerable lone women for his depraved attack in a similar fashion to Wayne Cousin's killing of Sarah, Everard 6 months prior. The court also heard how the defendant had no previous convictions, but had tried to strangle his former partner. Mrs. Nessa's family, including her sister Jabina Yasmin, watched as the Albanian national admitted killing the schoolteacher. The Old Bailey heard Selimaj had a history of violence, having previously put his hands around the throat of his former partner in a strangling motion. 2 hours before he attacked Mrs. Nessa, Selimaj had sought to contract his former partner to pressure her to engage in sexual activity. Alison Morgan QC said, "The prosecution will submit. This was a premeditated attack. Premeditated not in the sense that it targeted Sabina Nessa, but it targeted any lone female who would have been vulnerable to the attack on the location." Mrs. Morgan added the attack was carried out with extreme violence. Kochi is said to have beaten Nessa so violently that the road sign he used for a weapon broke up into pieces in his hands, the Old Bailey heard. He was later caught on CCTV using wet wipes to try and clean his DNA from a nearby park bench before heading back to his hotel. Officers later found Selimaj had purchased a rolling pin, which was not used in the attack. In a police interview, the defendant previously made no comment except to deny murder when asked directly if he was responsible for killing Mrs. Nessa. Police have never been able to establish a motive for the murder, and some detectives believe Selimaj may have killed someone just for the thrill of it. Selimaj, from Eastbourne, East Sussex, was arrested in the seaside town and charged with her murder 8 days after the attack. Mrs. Nessa had made plans to meet a friend at the Depot Bar in Kidbrooke Village on the evening of September 17th. From her home, her route took her through Cater Park where Selimaj was waiting. Mrs. Morgan said, "Some of her movements through the park and the attack on her were captured on CCTV footage. The male shown on that CCTV footage is alleged to be this defendant." The prosecutor said an examination of Mrs. Nessa's body showed no positive signs of sexual assault, but that it couldn't be excluded. The defendant removed Mrs. Nessa's tights and underwear and lifted her clothes so that the mid and upper parts of her body were exposed. The circumstances in which Mrs. Nessa's body was found demonstrate the sexual motivation that must have existed, she added. 3 days before, the defendant put his plan into action by booking a room at the 5-star Grand Hotel in Eastbourne, the town where he already had accommodation. His reservation was for the night of September 17th, and he arrived earlier in the day to check in. Kochi spoke to hotel staff and was captured walking through the lobby wearing the same clothes as the suspect later caught on CCTV in Kidbrooke. The defendant's Nissan Micra was tracked by cameras, and cell site evidence was gathered to identify his movements from Eastbourne to South London later that day. The evidence showed the defendant also used his bank card at Sainsbury's in Kidbrooke. He was captured in footage wearing distinctive trainers with a thick white sole, which were later seized from his house and found to have blood traces on them. The defendant entered Cater Park shortly after 8 p.m. and lay in wait for half an hour before Mrs. Nessa arrived. Mrs. Morgan said, "The defendant is seen in effect loitering in locations around the park before spotting the deceased, checking to see if anyone else was nearby before turning and running after her. He is then seen to move towards the deceased and striking her repeatedly using a weapon, which was approximately 2 feet in length. In fact, It was a weapon which appeared to break up during the course of the many strikes on the deceased. The CCTV footage shows the defendant then carrying the deceased, who appeared to be unconscious by that point, up a bank and effectively out of sight. Selimaj's actions afterwards were out of camera shot, but Mrs. Nessa was not seen alive again. Mr. Justice Sweeney adjourned sentence until April 7th. Speaking outside the Old Bailey on Friday, Mrs. Nessa's sister Sabina broke down in tears as told how the guilty plea was difficult to digest. She said it was a step in the right direction, but did not bring her sister back. She said, "We as a family are broken, and there is not a day that goes by that we do not think of her. There are no words to describe the pain we are going through, and the pain which he has caused. The fact we will never know the motive for why he killed our sister is not only frustrating, but heartbreaking. No family should go through what we are going through, and each day is not getting any easier." Helen Elwood, from the Crown Prosecution Service, added Sabina Nessa was 28 years old when her life was cut short as a result of truly evil violence inflicted on her as she walked through a park. Kochi Selimaj has shown little remorse for his premeditated and predatory attack on a lone woman who was a stranger to him. His cowardly actions have devastated a family and caused immeasurable pain to all those who knew and loved Sabina. The prosecution was able to build the strongest possible case, resulting in Selimaj admitting his guilt as a result of meticulous investigation led by the Metropolitan Police, which included an extensive review of CCTV footage and detailed forensic work. She said the CPS was committed to prosecuting violence against women and girls, and she hoped the conviction would bring some sense of justice to Mrs. Nessa's family and friends. It comes as a former colleague, who asked not to be named, said Selimaj was ambitious and moved to the UK to better himself and had taken a job as a pizza delivery driver at Domino's. He said he was only been married for a while and he was living in a flat with his wife. He wanted to get ahead. He wanted to move from their flat. He wanted to make some money and get another job. His wife also was working and they were saving for a better flat. He seemed ordinary, normal, a regular guy. I was shocked when I found out he had been arrested. A former neighbor, Piotr Graz, said everyone was shocked when he was arrested. He was married with a very nice wife and they seemed very close. They wanted to get a bigger flat. I know Kochi used to go to London to see people he knew from his Albanian community. He used to go when he wasn't working. He seemed like a regular guy and I would never think he was guilty of the crimes he has been accused of. He was so mild and calm. He said, "I'm not sure his wife is even in the country anymore. I haven't seen her for a long time." In October 2021, around 200 people gathered in Eastbourne, East Sussex, to pay tribute to the schoolteacher and protest the crisis of violence against women. The peaceful demonstration was marked by cheers and applause as those addressing the crowd spoke out against victim blaming. Later, the darkening sky was lit with the lights from dozens of mobile phones as a minute's silence was held for Mrs. Nessa. Sabina's sister Sabina broke down as she addressed crowds. She said, "Words cannot describe how we are feeling. This feels like we are stuck in a bad dream and can't get out of it. Our world is shattered. We are simply lost for words. No family should go through what we are going through." The vigil came after public outrage and debate over women's safety and policing in the wake of the murder of Sarah Everard, who was killed by a serving Met police officer. A university student was suffocated with a face mask and dumped inside a large suitcase by an obsessed man who followed her to Britain. Hina Bashir, 21, who was studying business management at Coventry University's London campus, went missing after visiting the home of warehouse worker Mohammed Arslan in Ilford, East London, July 2022. Days later, her body was found stuffed in a large suitcase and dumped in undergrowth near Upminster. Police uncovered evidence that 27-year-old Arslan had become obsessed with Mrs. Bashir, jurors were told. The pair had grown up in the same village in Pakistan, and the defendant followed Mrs. Bashir months after she came to Britain to study in November 2021. Ahead of his Old Bailey trial, Arslan pleaded guilty to her manslaughter. But he denies murder and perverting the course of justice by concealing her body. Prosecutor Gareth Patterson KC said the victim visited Arslan's home to collect some belongings she had left there while moving accommodation on the evening of July 11th. She did not leave the house alive, jurors were told. Mr. Patterson said, the next morning, the defendant set off from his house, dragging behind him a suitcase containing Hina Bashir's dead body. He got a lift from a taxi driver who lived in his house and traveled to an industrial estate by the EM25 near Upminster, near a business where he was employed as a warehouse worker. He got out of the taxi and dragged his suitcase to the side of a lane where he hid it in some undergrowth. He left the suitcase concealed there in the days that followed. After Mrs. Bashir's worried friends and family alerted police, the defendant's suitcase was found and opened, revealing Mrs. Bashir's body squeezed inside. Mr. Patterson told jurors on examination, the pathologist found that a face mask had been pushed inside her mouth. It was found there balled up. As for the cause of her death, Hina Bashir had been killed through asphyxia. The face mask that was forced into her mouth had stopped her from breathing. Investigators found a wealth of evidence implicating Arslan in the killing. Despite his initial denial, the court heard. Jurors heard the victim's blood was found on his bed and bedclothes. Matching face masks were recovered from his house, and telephone evidence showed the defendant had Mrs. Bashir's phone and was looking at her messages and photographs in the hours after her final visit. The taxi driver confirmed he drove Arslan with his heavy suitcase to the industrial estate the next morning, the court was told. CCTV footage captured Arslan leaving his house with the suitcase, and then later dragging it along the lane to where it was eventually discovered, Mr. Patterson said. In addition, Arslan's DNA was identified on the suitcase handle, and soil from the deposition site was found on his shoes. Referring to his earlier guilty plea, Mr. Patterson said, all the evidence proved what the defendant has finally accepted today, that he was responsible for the killing. Following Arslan's arrest, police found evidence on his phone that he had become close to the victim when she was a teenager growing up in Pakistan. Mr. Patterson said, the defendant was later to insist to the police that there was no relationship between the two of them. However, when the police translated the materials found on his phone, they found that he had been repeatedly in contact with her, declaring his love for Hina Bashir. He had allegedly spoken about wanting her to be his wife and having a family with her, while other messages suggested she was engaged to another man, the court was told. Arslan allegedly reacted to the information with shock and sent messages to suggest that he thought she had cheated on him. In more recent messages from 2021, Arslan appeared to be trying to contact Mrs. Bashir by posing as a woman, it was claimed. Mr. Patterson said, the police also found on his phone a very large number of photographs of Hina Bashir, some of them having been photoshopped or altered using software or apps. They found pictures of her on which love hearts had been added, and they found collages that had been created of her image. The evidence suggests that he was obsessed with her. After moving to Britain, the intensity of the defendant's feelings continued, and he described her as his fiancée, the court was told. Mr. Patterson added, however, it appears Hina Bashir did not want to be with him, and in fact had a relationship after she came here with another young man. He was sentenced at the Old Bailey to life with a minimum term of 20 years. In an impact statement, Mrs. Bashir's father, Bashir Khan, spoke of his beautiful, bubbly girl, adding that animals would treat my daughter better. He treated her in a heinous and brutal way. An American kindergarten teacher, who is the mother of twins, was stabbed to death in the bathroom of an Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates shopping mall by a robed figure dubbed the Reem Island Ghost. The attack on the teacher, identified by her family as 47-year-old Ibolya Ryan, comes just weeks after the U.S. embassies in the Middle East warned citizens of an anonymous posting on a jihadist website encouraging attacks against teachers at American schools in the Middle East. In an online profile, Ryan said she was born in Romania, but trained as a teacher in the United States and worked in 4 countries over 15 years. I wanted to experience the Arab world and experience their culture and daily life, she wrote on the teacher recruiting site. I am working in a very traditional neighborhood, and it is very unique to learn and understand their culture. The U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi confirmed an American citizen was killed in a public restroom at a shopping mall on Reem Island and said it is working with all appropriate authorities. Abu Dhabi police released surveillance video that shows the suspect, wearing a traditional black robe, gloves, and face cover known as a niqab, coming into the mall shortly after 1 p.m. local time. The person is then seen exiting an elevator and having a quick interaction with a mall security officer before grabbing a newspaper and heading into the bathroom. According to the timestamp on the video, the suspect hustles out of the bathroom around 90 seconds later and heads straight for the elevator as bystanders scatter. At the elevator door, a female bystander apparently tries and fails to stop the suspect, who dashes into the elevator and strides out of the building. The video also contained images of a blood-stained kitchen knife and blood spattered across the bathroom floor. The injured woman was immediately rushed to Sheikh Khalifa Medical City, where she succumbed to the wounds she sustained in the attack, Abu Dhabi police said in a statement. Police said an investigation is underway into the cause of the fight and the suspect's motive, identity, and gender. Mr. Rashid Mohammed, head of Abu Dhabi's Criminal Investigation Department, said that police are now caring for the victim's twins. She had a 3rd child who was not with her in the Emirates. Ben Glickman, the CEO of Footprints Recruiting, said Ryan was happy enough in Abu Dhabi that she had talked about extending her teaching contract or finding another position there. She was very warm, enthusiastic, he said. I know prior to moving to the UAE, she worked in special education. She worked one-on-one with a Down syndrome child in Colorado, I believe. She was a compassionate, warm, and loving person. He said that other expatriate teachers were scared by the crime, but were waiting for police to release more information on the motive. On October 29th, the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi issued a warning to U.S. citizens about the anonymous posting encouraging attacks against American teachers, but said it was unaware of any specific credible threat against any American or other school or individual in the United Arab Emirates. Nonetheless, the mission is working with local schools identified with the United States to review their security posture, it said. U.S. citizens residing in or visiting the UAE should remain vigilant regarding their personal security. In her profile for Footprints Recruiting, Ryan encouraged others to try teaching in foreign countries. She wrote, I would say be positive, open-minded, flexible, and take every challenge as a learning experience. Also be thankful that you are able to have the experience of working abroad. I think at the end it makes you not just learn about others, but also about yourself. The murderer, Aliyah Bader, 31, was found guilty of stabbing to death Ibolya Ryan, as well as creating a handmade bomb she placed in front of an Egyptian-American doctor's home, and was sentenced to death on June 29, 2015. On August 15, 2009, the tiny Middle Eastern nation of Kuwait witnessed the deadliest civilian tragedy in the country's history that would send shockwaves through the country. The tragedy would forever be ingrained in the minds of Kuwaitis and lead to one of the only times the nation implemented the death penalty on a woman. 23-year-old Nasra Al Enezi and her 36-year-old husband, Zaid Zafiri, were a prosperous pair with 2 children, aged 5 and 3. According to Kuwaiti law, men are permitted to have multiple wives, and in August 2009, Zaid Zafiri decided to enter into a second marriage. Nasra was less than thrilled about this, but did not have many options available to her but to let it happen. Divorce is heavily discouraged and considered shameful in the Islamic faith, which the couple adhered to. On the night of August 15, 2009, friends and family members gathered to celebrate the wedding. In Kuwait, it is a tradition for weddings to be segregated based on gender, with the bride, her female guests, and young children in a private tent. The men would be close by celebrating in another location. On this fatal night, the female tent was packed with over 100 guests, dancing, eating, and celebrating with their loved ones. The tent was suddenly engulfed in flames, with only one exit. In a panic, the guests tried to flee, causing a stampede. Unfortunately, many who were not able to escape were trapped inside. It took only 3 minutes for the entire tent to burn down. These 3 minutes resulted in the deaths of 57 women and children, and left 90 more injured. The initial death toll was 42 victims, but over the year, it rose to 57. Many victims were hospitalized for long, agonizing months before finally dying as a result of their injuries. The bodies were so badly charred that authorities called forensic specialists to identify the victims. It didn't take long for authorities to realize that someone deliberately started this fire. They found their suspect to be 23-year-old Nasra Al Enezi. A witness at the scene, a woman who was later identified as Nasra's maid, testified that she saw Nasra pour gasoline around the tent. When police apprehended her, she confessed to pouring petrol and setting the tent on fire. The wedding that Nasra confessed to setting on fire was her husband's wedding to his second wife. In Kuwait, a man is permitted legally and religiously to marry more than one wife. Nasra's husband was celebrating his wedding to his second younger bride. Nasra claimed physical and mental abuse at the hands of her husband, and his relatives drove her to set the tent on fire. The authorities, based on the physical evidence and Nasra's testimony, labeled this arson a premeditated crime, with the primary motive being revenge. Both the bride and groom survived the fire unharmed. The initial reaction to the death of 57 women and children was grief, followed soon by anger. People were angry and demanded punishment for the person responsible. Nasra's lawyer believed that public opinion played a role in the trial's outcome, and the verdict was already decided by the intense public reaction. Nasra soon redacted her confession and claimed that she only poured cursed water around the tent, not gasoline. However, the witness testimony and the evidence contradicted her claim. Some sources reported that murder was never her intention, and she wanted to ruin the celebration. However, the tent's material was highly flammable, and the lack of fire exits caused this tragedy. The investigation concluded that Nasra instigated the fire intentionally. The verdict for the murder in Kuwait is the death penalty. A verdict was almost guaranteed in Nasra's case, since the investigation concluded that the fire was deliberate murder. While the death penalty verdict is common in Kuwait for cases of murder, the judgment is rarely carried forth for women. Another layer to consider in Kuwaiti law is the victim's family's right to retribution. The victims' families can waive their right to retribution and compromise with the accused in a court of law, which will remove the death penalty option. However, considering the high number of victims and nature of the victim's death, not a single family member waived their right to retribution. Another exception was pregnancy. According to Kuwaiti law, death sentences for pregnant women are commuted to a life sentence. Nasra claimed that she was pregnant with her third child during her incarceration. However, her husband's relative working in the jail forced her to take medication. Unfortunately, this medication caused her to miscarry her child. The husband's relative has since been transferred from the facility. Her lawyer hoped that her young age and mental state would make her eligible for a pardon. But the courts upheld the death penalty out of respect for the deceased, their families, and the survivors living with the physical and mental scars caused by Nasra's actions. Her death penalty was controversial, but not unsurprising, considering the death toll. Some believed that this tragedy could have been prevented by rethinking cultural norms regarding polygamy and the treatment of women in Kuwait. Soon after the tragedy, Kuwait banned wedding tents in the country, citing safety concerns. At the age of 26, Nasra was executed by hanging by the prison authorities on January 25, 2017. Chilling CCTV shows the horrifying moment a vicious sex predator prowled the streets of London for targets before he became fixated on aspiring lawyer Zara Aleena and murdered her, just 9 days after the savage thug had been released from jail. Jordan McSweeney ambushed Zara Aleena and punched her in the back of the head before dragging the 35-year-old into a driveway and kicking her as she lay on the ground as she went home on a night out in June of 2022. As the law graduate lay dying, the brute sexually assaulted her, then grabbed her handbag, mobile phone, and keys. He then walked away but returned moments later to deliver the fatal final blows. Prosecutor Oliver Glasgow King's counsel said that McSweeney, also 35, launched an attack upon a lone female late at night, making her way home, a woman who stood no chance. The thug stood in the dock today and stared at the floor as he entered his guilty pleas, while Mrs. Aleena's family looked on. At a previous hearing, the court was told McSweeney was a prolific offender and had been released from prison on license on June 17th, just days before the murder. He had been in prison for criminal damage, racially aggravated harassment, and unauthorized possession of a knife in prison. He has 28 convictions for 69 separate offenses, including burglary, theft of a vehicle, criminal damage, assaulting police officers, and assaulting members of the public while on bail. 2 days before the murder, McSweeney's license was revoked for failing to keep appointments with probation services. But the recall request was still being processed, and police had yet to be informed he was to be arrested. Earlier on the night of the murder, he had been caught on CCTV following other women through the streets before he became fixated on Zara, a popular student who was caring for her mother and grandmother. Mr. Glasgow told the court the defendant has been charged in connection with the violent death of Zara, who was attacked in the early hours of the morning of 26 June. Witnesses and CCTV footage identified McSweeney as the person who carried out the savage and brutal attack. He can be seen on CCTV footage following and observing a number of different women, obviously interested in them and their movements. Mr. Glasgow said, "Tragically, for Zara Aleena, it was her on whom he became fixated. Having dragged her into the driveway of number 268, he forced her around, and then he is seen kicking and stomping repeatedly on her body. Mrs. Aleena's screams woke up nearby residents, who frantically dialed 999. When she was discovered, she was already fatally wounded from the onslaughts. She was bleeding, struggling to breathe, had clearly sustained serious head injuries, and was also partially naked," the prosecutor said. Police and paramedics attended and attempted to give life-saving first aid to her, but the injuries that she had sustained were so severe that nothing could be done to save her. She was taken to hospital at around 4:30 a.m. and was declared dead shortly afterwards. Mrs. Aleena, who had recently started work at the Royal Courts of Justice, died from severe head injuries. CCTV tracked McSweeney to the caravan he lived in, and police found him there. During a search, officers found blood-stained clothing and shoes, which matched those seen on the attacker on CCTV. McSweeney is further linked to the attack through forensic evidence. Blood staining found on the wall at Cranbrook Road contained finger marks that matched his fingerprint. This proves beyond any doubt, we suggest, that this defendant followed, attacked, and brutally murdered Zara Aleena, Mr. Glasgow said. McSweeney was questioned by police and sat in silence throughout all 3 interviews, refusing to even confirm his personal details. All he said was that he had ADHD and split personality disorder. While in custody, he was also said to have threatened police officers. Having been charged with murder, he was remanded into custody after a judge found he was a substantial risk to the public, especially lone women. Zara's family described her as independent, big-hearted, and a joy. Her aunt Farah Naz had said her niece had been conscious of the dangers for women after the murders of Bibea Henry, Nicole Smallman, Sarah Everard, and Sabina Nessa, but she had felt safe walking in the community where she was well known. Mrs. Naz said, Zara was not a woman who was unaware that there were dangers in the world. She did not imagine what happened to those women would happen to her. She didn't know she was going to be on this list because in her mind, she took those precautions. Zara had begun working at the Royal Courts of Justice 5 weeks before her death, and was the happiest she had ever been, her family said. McSweeney's plea hearing had been delayed after the defendant caught COVID in custody. His barrister, George Carter Stevenson KC, said he is still feeling unwell from COVID, but realizes the importance of being here today. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb adjourned sentencing until December 14th. She told McSweeney, "You pleaded guilty to very serious matters. I'm sure you appreciate the kind of sentence you will receive. But I will listen very carefully to the Crown's opening of the case and the submissions on your behalf, so it's in your interests to cooperate with those representing you." After the hearing, Senior Crown Prosecutor Olkay Sapanoglu welcomed the pleas, saying it was a horrific attack on a woman walking home after a night out with a friend. It appears clear that McSweeney was intent that night on finding a woman to attack. Having seen Zara walking home, he decided to follow her. Having followed her for several minutes, he pulled Zara into the driveway of a house where he carried out his assault. He sexually assaulted her, then brutally stomped on her several times before appearing to walk away. Moments later, he returned, only to stamp on her several times more, and then, finally, leaving her for dead. McSweeney did not display a shred of humanity toward Zara. Indeed, having completed his initial assault, he returned to inflict further injuries, leading to her death. At no stage during his police interviews did he express any sorrow for his actions. Zara's family will never recover from the senseless loss of their daughter, but I hope that these guilty pleas bring them some comfort. Finally, I would like to pay tribute to the police, who worked tirelessly to trace Zara's killer, allowing us to build the strongest case possible against McSweeney. McSweeney will be sentenced at the Old Bailey on December 14th. Speaking outside court, Detective Chief Inspector Dave Wellams said Mrs. Aleena was a beloved friend and family member. He said, "She was attacked while walking alone on a residential street. She had every right to be there. She had every right to feel safe. Instead, she was a victim of shocking violence. My thoughts are with her family and her friends. I cannot imagine the pain that they've experienced over the past 5 to 6 months. It is clear she was truly loved by all those that knew her. Tackling violence against women and girls and tracking down those who wish them to do harm is amongst the Met's highest priorities. Jordan McSweeney has pleaded guilty today to the most serious offenses. He's clearly a very dangerous individual, and his guilty plea today means that he is certain to serve a considerable period of time behind bars. The ex-girlfriend of murderer Jordan McSweeney has revealed to Mail Online how she endured 4 years of violence and controlling behavior at his hands before summoning up the courage to leave him for good. But Samantha Bryan, 30, now regrets not pressing assault charges against the wannabe gangster, who went on to kill aspiring lawyer Zara Aleena earlier this year. Mrs. Bryan told Line that Miss Sweeney once stamped on her so badly, it left an imprint of his trainer on her face, just as he did to Mrs. Aleena, who suffered fatal head injuries. Speaking exclusively to Mail Online, Mrs. Bryan told how violent Miss Sweeney, 29, left the mark across her right eye socket and cheek after a savage beating. Describing going to the police, she said, "I gave them a statement, telling them just what he'd done, but I dropped the charges. I just couldn't go through with it. At the time, my thinking was that I'd at last got rid of him from my life, after 4 horrible years, and I was still scared he or one of his acolytes would seek some sort of vengeance. Knowing what he did to the poor woman in Ilford, I wish I had gone ahead with it. Jordan is nothing more than a wannabe gangster with no respect whatsoever for women. I hope he's locked up for the rest of his life. No woman is safe around him." Miss Sweeney would also punch, kick, and bite her, and once threw her out into the street after snatching her phone, forcing her to borrow a mobile from a homeless man so she could call her mother to pick her up. And Mrs. Bryan, who became pregnant by Miss Sweeney, also told how he would cynically cuddle up to her at night, only in order to hide her wounds from his aunt when the young couple stayed with her. McSweeney today admitted the murder and sexual assault of Zara Aleena as she walked home through Ilford, East London in June. Mrs. Aleena, 35, died after suffering traumatic injuries after she was punched in the back of the head and stomped on before McSweeney tried to sexually assault her. The sickening details of her gruesome death sent a shiver down Mrs. Bryan's spine as she revealed, "I know just was a nasty, horrible monster he really is. My heart goes out to her. My only hope now is that nobody else has to suffer at his hands. And he's put away for the rest of his life." Mrs. Bryan, from Strood, Kent, first met McSweeney in 2007 when she was just 15, and he had recently moved to the area from Dagenham, East London. At first, she said she found him charming and funny, but it did not take long for the mask to slip. She told Mail Online, "I thought he was nice to begin with, but he soon showed his true character, and I began to realize it was all an act. He pretty quickly started to control what I did, and if I ever stood up to him, I'd pay the price for it. I moved in with him when I was nearly 17, and I lived with him, his mom and mom's partner, at their home in Rochester. Jordan always expected me to stay at home. He hated me going out without him. Yet he would disappear for hours, sometimes days on end, and wouldn't tell me where was going or where he'd been. There was one time when he came home after a few days away somewhere. I heard him at the door, and I shouted down to him from an upstairs window, asking him where he'd been. He exploded with fury. He literally kicked the door off its hinges and raced up the stairs. I ran to his mother's room at the top and tried to hide there, but he found me and punched and kicked me. I instinctively curled up into a ball, and he continued attacking me until he physically grew tired and stopped. That was the first time he really weighed into me, but it wouldn't be the last." Mrs. Bryan fell pregnant with Miss Sweeney's baby in 2010 when she was aged 18. Tragically, she lost the child. Soon after, the couple moved 20 miles away to Dagenham, East London, to stay with his aunt. However, life did not improve. In fact, it got worse, as McSweeney's rages continued. Mrs. Bryan recalled, "We had one argument. Jordan had become even more volatile and violent. I think he was accusing me of cheating on him. He beat me up, and when he'd finished punching and kicking me, he grabbed my phone out of my hands and threw me out of his aunt's house. I didn't know anyone else in Dagenham, and it was far away from my family home, and I had no means of calling anyone to pick me up. I had no money on me, and in the end, I had to ask a homeless man to borrow his phone and call my mom to come and collect me." Mrs. Bryan said she foolishly accepted McSweeney's apologies and assurances that he had changed, and she moved back in with him. However, There was to be one more violent row in May 2011 that would bring her to her senses and leave him for good. She said, Jordan had again gone missing for a couple of days and left me at his auntie's house while he was out gallivanting. When he eventually returned, we started rowing about it in the bedroom, and then he switched. He punched me to the floor, bit my arm, and started kicking me. He stomped on my face with such force that you could see the imprint of his trainer on my face the following morning. I thought he'd blinded me to begin with because I had trouble seeing out of my right eye immediately afterwards. The most sickening aspect was that later that night he climbed into bed with me and cuddled up to me to force me away from the door in the room. I know he only did that because his aunt would sometimes come in before she went to bed, if we'd had a row and check everything was all right. He obviously didn't want her to see what he'd done to me. But when I went downstairs the following morning, she took one look at me and gasped and asked if Jordan had done that. When I told her that he had, she told me, listen, you have to leave him and get as far away from him as you possibly can. I left him there and then and never saw him again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to stay tuned with the latest uploads.